Hello, and welcome back to Special Ed on Special Ed. I am your host, Dana Jonson. And today, my guest is Dr. Jay Dunn, who's a chiropractor and functional medicine expert with over 30 years of experience. Hi, how are you today?
Great. Thank you for inviting me on, Dana. I appreciate it.
Thank you for coming. I'm really excited to have this conversation because it's a new topic to me. So I'm always excited when it's something new. I want to introduce Dr. Dunn. She's renowned for her pioneering work in holistic kinesiology and holistic methylation. Despite her success in finding solutions for many, Dr. Dunn faced her own health challenges with moderate depression and fatigue. Her journey led her to the realms of genetics and biochemistry, where she discovered the root cause of her own depression was a genetic variant affecting her vitamin D receptor. This breakthrough in understanding the impact of genetics on health inspired the creation of My Happy Genes system of genetic testing, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Our conversation will delve into the significance of genetics and epigenetics in health, exploring how diet, lifestyle, and emotional trauma can influence gene expression and overall well-being. Dr. Dunn's insights promise to enlighten and offer transformative approaches to health and wellness. So I'm excited to get into that, but before I do, as always, I need to play my disclaimer. So here it goes. The information in this podcast is provided for general informational and entertainment purposes only and may not reflect the current law in your jurisdiction at the time you're listening. Nothing in this episode creates an attorney-client relationship, nor is it legal advice. Do not act or refrain from acting on the basis of any information included in or accessible through this episode without seeking appropriate legal or other professional advice on the particular facts and circumstances at issue from a lawyer or service provider licensed in your state, country, or other appropriate licensing jurisdiction. So hello, Dr. Dunn, or shall I call you Jay?
Jay is fine, yeah.
And I find that interesting because Jay, you'll see in my show notes, is an initial, but that is actually your first name, correct?
Yeah, that's what they gave me at birth. They had a little argument about what to name me and ended up just giving me the letter J. So,
so you could do with it what you want. That sounds interesting.
I think that was their idea. I just haven't figured out what to do with it yet.
I love it. I always love names with a story. So great. So why don't you tell us about your background and how you came to be where we are today in genetics and your practice, what you provide. I know a lot of it stems from your own journey, so I think it would be a great place to start.
Yeah, and I think that's true of a lot of healers is, we get into it looking for our own answers or those of our loved ones. It's usually the case when you start talking to healers, but
I think it's the same with special education people. We always have some connection. That's how we got here.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. It takes you on that journey. So yeah, I had a successful practice. I'm a chiropractor and do functional medicine, as you mentioned. And I had a lot of different modalities in my practice, including the kinesiology that you mentioned, which is muscle testing. And had a very successful practice in Albuquerque, New Mexico for over 30 years. But there were some lingering things that made me think that maybe we were missing a piece of the puzzle, because I would work with emotional kind of issues. I'd work with structural, with the chiropractic. I'd work with nutritional, the functional medicine approaches. I had a lot of tools in my bag, but one of the things that bothered me was my own health, which was, as you mentioned, struggling with depression, lifelong depression. And thinking that it was my fault, kind of like, what's the matter with me? Why can't I just be happy?
That's very common, right?
Yeah. And then chronic fatigue syndrome, and I would struggle for my energy on a regular basis. But as a practitioner, you kind of have to, just power through. And even as a parent, you have to kind of power through and get through the day and do the best you can. So I kept looking for my own answers and I didn't find it with all the things that I knew. And then the other thing that kind of drove me to look for the missing piece, essentially, in healthcare, of course, this is all talking about natural healthcare, was the fact that some of my patients didn't respond to anything I did. There was a subset. I was really successful. I had a year-long waiting list and had very good success with a lot of people, but there were some people that I just couldn't get anywhere with them. And so I knew we were missing a piece of the puzzle. The third thing that made me think that perhaps the answer was in the genetic realm was my dad. He died of lung cancer when I was 20. He was 55, but he did everything to get lung cancer. Smoking and not a healthy guy. But his best friend, George was his name, did the same things. Ended up marrying my mom after my dad died. and lived another 30 years doing the same things.
Doing the exact same stuff. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's fascinating, isn't it? Who it knocks out and who it doesn't.
Yes. And so the only thing that we could say about that is, we park it over here and go, that's genetics, that's good genes sort of thing in the past. And so I knew that was there, but we just didn't have a way of really getting in there and understanding genes or looking at, can we work with genes? Can we understand them? And do they affect, not just longevity, but other aspects of our health? And so one day I was hearing this word methylation, and you mentioned it in the preview there.
Yeah, I'm not sure I said it correctly, but I did mention it. Oh, good. Yay. Look at me.
You nailed it. You nailed it. I kept hearing that word and I'm like, what is methylation? And so kind of did a deep dive and Googled it. And I found this video by a guy named Rich von Konynenberg. And it was him talk at a conference in Sweden. And he's talking about genetic variants and their association with chronic fatigue syndrome, and myalgic encephalitis is basically what they call it now. And he was looking at the underlying biochemistry of the body and how genetic variants can affect that biochemistry. And I was like, I got chills. I got goosebumps because I was like, yeah, this is the missing piece. And I'm sitting there writing notes and I'm like, oh my God. And did a deep dive back into biochemistry, which I hated in school. It was just like my worst subject. Chemistry, biochemistry, no thanks. It started to make sense to me looking at it through the lens of genetics and what happens at the body. So if you've inherited genetic variants that slow down your detoxification pathways, then you're going to be more sensitive to toxins and you're going to become toxic a lot more readily. And so, when I started to look at things in that way, or how our genes affect our biochemistry at the cellular level, I went, wow, this is an interesting concept. So I got my genes tested. And so I went to, I did one of the over-the-counter testing companies. And then you can put the results into these different programs online that'll pull out genes that they think are important or that we know something about. And one
is
of
that
them
like 23andMe? Is that kind of thing? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. When I got my report back, one of the big glaring variants that I had in a homozygous variants, let me explain that for a second. You get a set of genes from mom, set of genes from dad, and they're basically the code to tell your body how to do certain things. If you have a variation from the normal code that you've inherited from one parent, that's a heterozygous variant. If both parents gave you the wrong code for that particular gene, that's what we call homozygous, and it has a much more powerful effect on the physiology. It can reduce the function of that enzyme that it's coded for by about 70%. So think of it this way. Let's say you inherited a homozygous variant for making lactase, which is the enzyme that breaks down lactose, right? You're going to be 70% reduced in your ability to digest lactose. So you're going to be largely lactose intolerant, right? So one of the genes that I saw was the one you mentioned, the vitamin D receptor. And I was like, well, what does that mean? What the heck is that? It's the VDR.
Yeah.
I'm homozygous for the VDR, which means I'm 70% reduced in my ability to absorb vitamin D. And I went, well, that's interesting. Wow. As a natural healthcare practitioner, I know how important vitamin D is for health in lots of ways. We think of it normally as like the bone health vitamin.
Yeah.
But when I started to research, like, what is the research out there on the vitamin D receptor? What if you have a variant there? What does that mean? And one of the first studies I found was a higher incidence of lung cancer when you smoke if you have that genetic variant. And I went, okay, that was dad.
Wow. Oh, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Second thing I found was your immune system will be immobilized. You won't be able to fight off infections well. And so there's the chronic fatigue syndrome often associated with like an Epstein-Barr virus, right? No wonder I've never been able to get on top of that. Had mono at 16. And then the other thing it does is upregulate the enzymes that help your brain make serotonin and dopamine. And those are our happy hormones. And I went, oh my gosh, this makes so much more, this makes sense to me. This explains all of these mysteries that I've been rattling around in my head for so long. And I went, okay, well, sucks to be me, or can we do something about it? How do I work with that? So I'm a
solution-oriented person too. I'm like, where's the answer? Where's the answer?
Exactly. And so I was like, okay, well, how do I make that receptor work better? Now I've inherited a genetic variant there and it's slower than normal. I can't absorb vitamin D well. No wonder my blood work always said my vitamin D levels were poopy doodles. It's a technical term.
Yeah, that's a clinical term
um,
for it.
yeah. And I thought, well, okay, how do we make up for that? And I found an article that showed like what are the cofactors for vitamin D? How does it, how can we upregulate the ability of my body to absorb vitamin D? And I found the cofactors. I found an article and I thought, okay, well, I'm going to try it. And so I started taking these cofactors with vitamin D and bam, my brain came alive and it started making dopamine and serotonin. And for the first time in my life, I went, I think this is happy. I've heard about it, but my brain had never experienced it because it could
Right.
not make those neurotransmitters. And so it was like, oh my gosh, this is big.
That's wild.
So, when it works for you
Sure.
get, or somebody you love, or or whatever, you get kind of excited about it. And so I thought, well, I bet there are other genetic variants that work that way as well. And can we find the cofactors? And can we work with all kinds of conditions that we had not been able to work with in the past? And it was so. And so I started using it in my clinic. We had a whole team of researchers that were like, all right, we're going to deep dive into this gene and this gene and this gene. And pretty soon we found a pattern of biochemistry. And then we plugged in these genetic variants and then we saw how to work with it. And so that's kind of a cliff notes of where we went with it. But so we started to see results in all kinds of things. And sort of to speak to your audience and your, the parents of people that are struggling with ADD and ADHD, we saw some pretty good responses with that kind of stuff because there are enzymes that break down adrenaline and serotonin. And if you have a variant there and you're not able to break down some of these anxiety producing neurotransmitters, they're going to stay in your system. And so it makes a person not able to focus well because their nervous system is sort of on alert all the time.
Interesting. There's such a crossover between anxiety and ADHD as well. And it sounds like all of those sort of factor into what you're talking about.
Yeah, very much so. And so if you understand the biochemistry there's one of the particular genetic variants associated with ADD and ADHD is the COMT gene. It's the catechol-O-methyltransferase. And its job is to break down adrenaline, noradrenaline, dopamine. And if you can't break those down, they're chronically high in your system. And the interesting thing about the COMT people that are born with these variants, they're higher than normal IQ. Because the high dopamine that they're born with makes their higher intelligence. There's some interesting studies on that.
Oh, that is interesting.
Yeah, but it makes them tend toward ADD, ADHD, and so they're really smart, but they can't focus in school, and they struggle.
And that's a common combination as well, and I see that a lot with students, and so we're dealing with anxiety, ADHD, and either giftedness or whatever's considered really bright. And sometimes those kids can mask it and self-accommodate and get through without really being noticed until suddenly they hit, that performance cliff or whatever it is. And then suddenly it all comes out or they can't do it anymore. But I find that the children who have the higher IQs are able to hide it better for longer.
Yeah, that's true. And that's really
Which causes a lot of stress.
Yeah, right. I find that people self-medicate, and a COMT have to move. They have to keep moving. They're just like, they're always thinking. They're, very bright, creative, really interesting people. They can't shut it down. It's just like,
it never stops.
They don't sleep well. They don't relax. They just can't stop it.
Yeah. So what, for that example specifically, what would you recommend? What is the next step?
Well, we don't look at one gene, one remedy. It doesn't work that way. It turns out there's an interplay of genes that you have to take into account. So let me give you for instance, we looked at the biochemistry. It's like the VDR that I mentioned. If we upregulate that, it causes the brain to make more dopamine, more serotonin, more adrenaline. Now, if you have that comp variant that I mentioned, we're going to make your anxiety worse. if we don't balance that at the same time. So it became a little complicated when we look at this gene is going to affect how this gene works. So you can't ever like treat a gene in isolation or an enzyme in isolation.
Because they all interact like a machine, right? Like a machine. You can't just bend one piece and expect the rest of it to work.
Yes, exactly. And so it's this interplay of biochemistry. If you understand the biochemical pathways, you can work with it. And so I created a software program that could look at all the genetic variants that you've inherited, and then design a diet, lifestyle supplementation around these variants and their interplay. And that was the key, because there are a lot of companies out there that are testing genes, but they're looking at, you have the COMT, you have the VDR, you have the MA, whatever the genes are.
Right, one piece at a time.
Yeah. And so if you have this gene, take this. And it's like, oh my God, no, you're going to create all kinds of problems if you don't understand what's happening down below it, sort of like the sequence of events that happens in our biochemistry. So it's fascinating.
That is fascinating. I want to go back and look at my 23andMe now and like just analyze everything. Because, I'm qualified to do that now that we've talked.
Yes,
and I'm being very sarcastic, by the way.
One of the other genes that, in this mental health kind of realm is the MAO, and that's the warrior gene. And that is the gene that codes for the enzyme that breaks down serotonin. And so high serotonin, we think of like serotonin as our happy hormone. We want more of it, but too much of any hormone or any neurotransmitter is also adverse. And so if you have the warrior gene, you don't break serotonin down easily, and it can make you very irritable and grouchy and kind of have anger issues, but also some attention issues there as well. So if you add somebody that's inherited like an MAO and a COMT, that's a little bit of an OCD situation, because they're irritable and they're anxious, and they want things. Don't touch my things. Things have to be this way, And so if we can,
I can relate to that. I can relate to that.
So if we balance those two enzymes, the whole body calms down, and it's the coolest thing. People come back and they're like, I just feel content, like for the first time ever. And, they had been trying to meditate, or like you say, self-medicating, or trying to cover up their kind of what they've been born with. But if you get their physiology balanced, it's a whole new ballgame. It's just, they don't have to try so hard. Their physiology calms down and they can focus. And so,
I think to that point, it doesn't go away, right? It doesn't disappear. It's just, you can address it. Like if you stop addressing it, does it come back, or?
Oh, right. Yes. The genes are your genes. The genes aren't going to change. But if we
you can't change the genes, but you can
change the expression of the genes, an expression of how the enzymes are coded for, basically. So in my case, if I stop taking my supplements, yes, my depression is going to come back. I've tried it a few times. It's not a permanent answer, but it's a whole lot better than living in unhappyville.
Right.
To take a full of supplements that have no side effects, that are just nutrients, and my brain chemistry changes, is fine with me. I'll do that the rest of my life.
Yeah. Well, and we spend so much time trying to find the medications that work, and so many trials and errors. And then a child's body chemistry changes and suddenly the meds don't work, or, they're acclimating to a new one and it causes behavior. Like there's just always so many difficulties with medication. I guess when I'm thinking of medication, can medication address these issues, or are these strictly holistic remedies? I know you do holistic remedies, but I'm just saying in general, is there would that be in lieu of, in addition to medication, or how does that work? I don't know if I made sense.
Yeah. It's a good question. And there are companies that use genetic testing to find which medication would be best for a situation. In my world, I'd like to see people try natural remedies first, because they have little to no side effects, and a lot of these psychiatric drugs are going to have side effects. It's just the way they work, by shutting down enzymes or upregulating pathways. And so that, it's never without a price. Let's put it that way. However, that being said, there are people that really need it because they are suicidal, or they are in extreme case. And while you're working on maybe some underlying genetic variants and counseling and lifestyle remedies, to do both is not a problem either, under the care of a psychiatric practitioner, or the primary care physician that, prescribed the meds.
Right.
You can do both. And I've had patients do that, like, okay, I'm going to upregulate my ability of my brain to make serotonin. Can you monitor my brain so that you see signs of too much serotonin and lower my dose on medications? So, they've been able to kind of do that.
Oh, interesting. So they can sort of work together.
Yeah.
And we're talking about natural approaches. And, you're talking about how you address them. Are there preventative measures, or is this like once you find it, you have to address it? I'm trying to figure out like what the process is. Are there things you can do? You still need to know, I guess, what your genes are, right?
Yeah.
That helps.
Really does, it does make a difference. I mean, because it tells you, a couple reasons for that, Dana, and I'll get back to the rest of your question. But one is compassion. For me, it was like huge to understand that it wasn't me. I mentioned earlier, it's like, why can't I just be happy? I couldn't. My brain chemistry was not conducive to happiness. It was like I didn't have the ability to make those neurotransmitters. And so compassion is the first piece. When you get your gene test back and you look at the results and you go, this is why I'm that way. It makes so much more sense. And it's not because I'm a bad person
No, not at all. And I think that is half the battle sometimes, is identifying what the issue is. Like, I know I told you I was diagnosed with dyslexia and ADHD when I was like 19. I was so relieved to be like, oh, there's a thing and I can do something about it. Like, that just relieves so much of it. And I would imagine it would be the same thing with this, when you realize like, oh, there's some physical piece that I can address to help make this work.
Yes, absolutely. And that is the first gift, is the compassion for ourselves and compassion for, our parents that gave us those genes too.
Yeah.
They likely were struggling with things, and, we blame them a lot of times. Like, if I'd had better parents, I would have, it's just human nature.
Kind of easy. Right? They're sort of soft targets, right? I
mean, especially if they're not around. And it's like,
exactly. But like, for example, I did 23andMe, and it says that I do not have the Alzheimer's gene, but I don't know what that means. I don't know if that means I'll never get it. They only can test for so much. So there's always new and evolving information. So I take it all with a grain of salt. But if somebody said, oh, I do have that Alzheimer's gene, are there things they can do to mitigate that? Or,
yes.
Okay.
So, and so it's not just brain chemistry stuff. We look at all of that kind of thing, your health risks, your cardiovascular risk, cognitive decline, all of those kind of things. And it isn't just one gene, one issue. There isn't like the Alzheimer's gene. There's several that contribute to it. So, one gene doesn't, condemn you to that. But one of the big ones is the BDNF, the brain-derived neurotropic factor, that is highly associated with Alzheimer's. And there are 3 things you can do that are lifestyle that are pretty easy. One is cold showers. They've found that actually helps increase your BDNF levels. High intensity interval training, the fast, slow kind of stuff.
Oh, interesting.
And then, intermittent fasting. So those are easy to implement, or, they're not traumatic, and they can greatly reduce your risk of Alzheimer's with that particular genetic variant.
Since you mentioned it, I'm curious, what is intermittent fasting? Because I think somebody said to me once, oh, I fast between these hours. And I was like, well, aren't you sleeping then? Like, isn't that fasting? So I'm not sure I understand what that is. And I know it's a sidetrack, but what is intermittent fasting?
Well, let's say you quit eating dinner at 6:00. You assign a time, and you don't eat again until 6 a.m. That's a 12-hour intermittent fasting. So some people will go midnight snack, and then you've blown it because it's only going to be 6 hours. But you can go longer. So if you go 13 hours, it would be 7:00 before you eat, or 8:00 is 14. You kind of find the best way to do this is to find your happy spot at the point at which you go, I'm going to die if I don't eat right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You've gone a little bit too long, and kind of back it up an hour, and you'll find your ideal level of intermittent fasting. And it turns out it's genetically determine whether it's going to be good for you and how long you can go. Some people can balance their blood sugar for longer periods of times than other people. And so the length of time for intermittent fasting is very much genetically individual.
Interesting. And intermittent fasting means that when you're fasting, you're not having anything but water, right? Are you allowed to have water? Like no coffee, no tea. It's like just water.
Yeah. There's, I think different people have different rules about that, but generally it's just water, between the hours of 6 and 6. And that has an incredible effect on your, what's called autophagy, which means our ability of our cells to sort of get rid of the old dead cells and get them out of your body. And so
interesting.
It's incredibly balancing and beneficial for longevity and detoxification and so many other things. So
that's so fascinating. I mean, genes are so fascinating to me. And I was not a big science person either when I was in school, but I always was fascinated with anything that came to, because it's like a puzzle, right? It's like a puzzle that you are putting together. And what other proactive health strategies do you find are effective for, children, whether it's with ASD or autism or what are the common disabilities that you find that you're seeing in your practice and you're able to mitigate?
Well, I'm not practicing anymore, but when I do the genetic testing, we test for those, so there are several genes that are associated with ASD or, the autism spectrums. And so we can show you which genes, have contributed to that condition. We can also show you, your risk of ADD, ADHD, your risk of depression, your risk of anxiety, PTSD, addictions. So you'll see these, what we call sliders. So, from 0 to 100, you'll see whether you're high risk or low risk on that spectrum. So one of the first things, the second report that we give you, if you're interested in going that way, is diet and lifestyle. And so it'll show you, lactose is out. You're completely lactose intolerant, or it's okay. Or gluten is out, or it's okay. Or nightshades, or, there a whole variety of foods that we test for, or food categories that we test for that can really help, especially with kids. If they're not able to take a bunch of supplements, I get it. Just changing their diet can have a profound effect on the expression of a lot of these genes, because food allergies can really contribute to difficulty focusing and mood disorders. It's what we call brain allergies, essentially.
Are they brain allergy? Because I hear this term too, which is sensitivities versus allergies. Is that a real differentiation?
Yes and no. I think the terms are kind of used interchangeably with a lot of people. Yeah, it's not always an allergic response. It can be a sensitivity or an ability to digest the food is another kind of aspect. We can kind of lump them all into, sensitivity.
Well, and I think of allergy as it makes you really, really sick, or you have an anaphylactic shock, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the reaction for you to have an allergy to something, right?
Right. And sometimes it's delayed. I've got a weird allergy to lettuce, which 24 hours later, I will have a massive headache and nausea and fatigue. And it's just like...
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So
lettuce of all things. And it took me a long time to figure it out because it was delayed. It was like, gosh. So you can have delayed reactions that affect your brain or mood. And it's a good idea to keep a journal, for parents to keep a journal of, he ate chocolate yesterday and today he's like a monster.
That's a good point, because it doesn't happen necessarily immediately after or within a couple hours.
Yeah. Dr. Doris Rapp, I don't know if you've ever heard of her.
No.
She was, I think she's still around. She was an MD who did a lot of work with brain allergies and understanding how it affects mood. If you watch some of her YouTube videos, they're stunning. How kids can turn from a calm, relaxed kid into this like screaming monster that's tearing your eyes out and wants to hurt you when they're exposed to certain foods that they're allergic to. And so, again, keeping a record of, and like, he was really calm yesterday and today he's a wreck. What did we do? That was different even, 24 to 48 hours previously.
Sure. Is it just food, or can it be environmental as well?
It can be environmental as well. And chemicals, pesticides, food additives, food colorings, those kind of things can do it as well. And we see those, there are certain genetic variants called HLAs, or human leukocyte antigens, that are associated with these kinds of reactions. They're almost like, they come from Neanderthal DNA, which is kind of interesting. Like our body's attacking itself because it doesn't recognize these things as self. So it begins a
Interesting.
mast
Yeah.
cell release and a histamine release, and creates problems. And histamine in the brain can cause swelling and mood changes and other fun things.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So when you have a child like that, I mean, I know like we had a neighbor who had to suddenly take out all their rugs and put hardwood floors in because they just discovered that their child had all these allergies that they didn't know, because all of her allergies were like not life threatening. They were mild, but they were all coming together and, in this general, like not feeling well and all this other stuff. And they had to, go ahead and do that. Are there other, I mean, I try not to use chemicals in our cleaning stuff, but I'm not going to lie. I let my cleaning people use whatever they want if they're willing to come and clean my house. But for me, myself. And so that I try, but it's not always easy. We're not sort of set up, I think, in a world where that's very easy. Maybe I'm wrong. But
No.
what kind of like household things recommendations do you make to people just generally for like healthy environment?
Well, I mean, that's a pretty big topic.
I have lots of big topics.
I know.
I'm like, I just want answers.
Yeah, I could go off on that, but in my world, I feel like you can't get away from it all. You can't live in a bubble. So I would like to see, the big strokes for sure. The chemicals, kick those out. And I agree, rugs are a great trapping place for molds and other things that we drag in off our
In
food.
our house, it's a great trapping place for cat pee.
Oh yeah, that's great.
It's awesome. It's great.
But I like to increase the resiliency of the body by looking at these genetic variants and then adding in the nutrients that upregulate detoxification or upregulate the brain chemistry or upregulate the breakdown of histamine that can be, the culprit, rather than trying to eliminate it's just impossible. Yeah. You can't get away from it. You can't get away from EMFs.
Yeah, you can't do everything. What is detoxification? Like, what is that? What's happening in your body? Because we say that a lot, and I see it a lot on products, for detox and detoxing your body. But what actually is it?
Well, that's a really good question. So there are two main pathways of detoxification in the liver. The first one takes the oil-soluble, the heavy-duty toxins, turns them into water-soluble, and that's what we call the phase 1. And it's upregulated, or it's governed by the CYP enzymes, or cytochrome P450s. So genetic variants there will inhibit your ability to break down oil-soluble toxins into water-soluble. That's not good, because then it
doesn't sound good.
No, it's not good. Phase 2 takes that intermediate substance that's been created that's actually more toxic than what you started with, and goes through phase 2 and turns it into an inert substance. So this all happens in the liver. CYP, the phase 1, is upregulated by the B vitamins. So certain specific B vitamins that upregulate, and that's part of methylation.
Okay.
Phase 2 is upregulated by amino acids, and amino acids come from proteins. So vegetarians are going to have a much harder time, if they're not getting proper proteins, detoxifying that phase 2, which can, if the phase 2
because I'm
is
vegan,
not,
so that's interesting.
Yeah, I find that detoxification is tough on vegans and vegetarians, because they don't combine well and get enough proteins. I'm not saying you can't. It's more difficult.
It's not easy. When I first decided to do it, I actually put up on my fridge a little food chart, but it was specifically to vegans. Like, this is how much you should have a day of each thing. And I had a little list and a checklist, so that every day I was making sure that I was hitting all the right marks, because there's no way I could have done it in my head. And I don't know that I still, now that I'm doing it on my own, I don't know that I hit all those marks, but haven't passed out lately. So I think that's good. Because I did try to go gluten-free at one point, and I was like, gluten-free and vegan, there's not a lot left.
No, yeah,
So
that's kind of,
I thought that maybe wasn't going to happen,
yeah.
but yeah, no, that's interesting because I think sometimes we choose diets, and I don't mean diet like losing weight diets, but stylistically diets because we think they're overall healthy,
Mhm.
but they might be eliminating something that's super important for us or for our body.
Right, your unique physiology. And so we look at, what's your best ratio of carbs, fats, and proteins for you specifically. And it's so individual. It's just
Mm,
fascinating. Some people are going to do well on a high protein diet, others are going to do well on a lower protein or higher carbohydrate, complex carbohydrates, or high fat, low fat. It's just fascinating how different each person is on what's best for their
yeah.
physiology or their genetics. So,
That's so interesting.
yeah.
So that's the My Happy Genes, right?
Yeah.
So tell me how that works. Tell me about My Happy Genes. And I think we have the story as to how it came to be. But can you explain more about that in detail?
Yes. So you mentioned the kinesiology, and I'm a muscle tester. And so that's how we really found this pattern that happens at the cellular level, all of the different genetic variants that affect detoxification, brain chemistry, histamine, breaking down or making methyl groups, essentially repairing DNA, all the things that happen at the cellular level. And so then, it's kind of a lengthy process. The holistic methylation system, it was created out of this. But so a practitioner would take about an hour and a half to test all of these pathways. And then I thought, well, not everybody's into muscle testing. They don't always vibe with it, and some people do. I wonder if I could create a software program that would make this easier, that could calculate the interplay of the genes and your best diet and your risks of, all these mental health kind of things or personality things, and your risk of health conditions, the cognitive decline that we mentioned, cardiovascular disease, et cetera. So I found a really great software development team, and we built the My Happy Genes program. So it would do it all for you. You didn't have to go and have the kinesiology done. And so it's a swab, which makes it a lot easier for kids. I know a lot of like the 23andMe, and they do a spit. It's really hard
Yes.
for elderly and kids to do. It was really tough. So we decided to use a swab, and you just, go in there and kind of scrape off some cheek cells. And it's all anonymous. So there's no tracking. They don't have any information about you. They don't have name, address, nothing at the lab. It's all by a barcode, which I was very passionate about because there are other companies that are tracking your data. Didn't think it was a
Yeah.
good,
I mean, we're tracked everywhere. So I've sort
right.
of moved on with my life. I think I'm in every database. Maybe that's
Uh-huh.
just my ego. Like then I'm like, who wants to follow me? But
Right.
it's all
I'm
out
not that
there.
important.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I'm not real paranoid about it, but I know a lot of people are. They're
Yeah.
concerned about, especially, going forward, maybe insurance companies get a hold of your data and say, I'm not going to insure you because you have this gene, or
Yeah.
I don't, I
That
don't
would
know.
be the biggest concern, I guess. That would be
Yeah.
where it would be very scary.
Yeah. So we didn't want any of that. So our that sample goes to the lab. They destroy your sample after 90 days, which is another safeguard. That information, the genetic information, we check for 675,000 SNPs or genetic variants. And that comes back to our database, and then we pull out the genes we know something about, the MAOs, the comps, the VDRs, and all the ones that I mentioned. And we give you a report. And so it calculates again, like the ADD or your addiction risk or PTSD risk, or, those are all on sliders. Then underneath it is this long report that shows you inherited this gene, you are homozygous for BDNF that you mentioned. You
Mhm.
click on that BDNF icon there, and it'll pop it open, and it'll say, "Oh, good things for you to do: intermittent fasting, high intensity interval training, and cold showers." So you get some information on that report, and then we also do the diet and lifestyle report, a biochemistry report, and a health risk and a supplement recommendations. And those three are only available through a practitioner because of something you just mentioned. In fact, my lawyer said, it's too much of a liability for you to recommend supplements, but a practitioner can do it. in person. So let's say somebody's on an antidepressant, we start messing around with their brain chemistry and they, kind of wax them out. So we
Right.
wanted to make sure that they were under the care of a physician who's trained in looking at these things when they go through the supplement recommendations and
Interesting.
the health risks.
So is that information you send to the practitioner, or do you just bring your report and say, this is what I learned?
No, they connect. So
Okay.
the practitioner has a practitioner portal, and the patient says, I want to connect with your portal. And so then the practitioner can see the patient's results and then talk to them about what it means and guide them on the diet that's recommended and the supplements that are recommended, and make sure that they're monitored on their progress.
Oh, that makes so much sense. So you mentioned PTSD, and I'm curious because you said, if you're susceptible to PTSD, because my thought of PTSD is that, it's a result of a traumatic event, right? So how are you does that just mean how you would respond to a traumatic event?
Yes.
Yeah.
You can have two people experience the same trauma. One of them is affected for the rest of their life, and the other one is going, yeah, that was bad, but whatever.
Interesting.
And so it's very much how your physiology is set up. If you're already in an anxiety mode and you add more to it, that neural pathway is married into a memory, and boom, it's triggered easily. So in somebody whose physiology is down here and kind of more relaxed, they go up here and they go back down, and it's not as hardwired into their physiology.
Do your genes change over time? I mean, I know your genes are your genes, but is there anything in our lifetime that can alter those? I'm not saying like they naturally evolve, but whether it's experiences or extracurricular choices, if someone's an alcoholic or a drug addict, does that impact their genes in how I guess what I'm thinking is in how they give them to a child, right? Like if you have a child at this point in your life versus if you have a child at that point in the life, are there changes in your genes that would impact what you send to that child's gene database?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question too. It's more in the epigenetics. And so the methylation that I mentioned, this methyl group is a carbon and 3 hydrogen molecules, and it's created through folic acid and B12. Do you remember the whole thing about folic acid? When you're pregnant, you should take folic acid to avoid birth defects. That's methylation, like turning on methylation.
Okay.
Methylation will turn off a gene. So spina bifida gene, you may have it, but if you're methylated correctly, it's covered up, it's turned off with folic acid and methylation. So these methyl groups can go along and, turn off a cancer gene or turn off, whatever you're inherited. That gene is there. It's just, it won't be expressed. And this is a really important concept, Dana, especially with women who are getting pregnant or thinking about getting pregnant, to make sure that their methylation patterns or their methylation nutrients are optimized to turn off any of those genes that potentially could result in a birth defect or, even autism or various conditions that can be inherited that way. You can turn them off. And so when that child is born, for the rest of their life, that gene is turned off. It isn't like you're going to turn on a spina bifida gene. It doesn't happen. Once you set that methylation pattern at birth. So it's an incredibly powerful thing to do. There's a really cool study done on agouti mice, which were clones, and they took one of the mice got methyl donors in their diet, and the other one were fed just kind of the standard American diet, basically. And then they had offspring, and the offspring of the ones that were fed methyl factors were thin. They were much healthier, lived longer. The ones that weren't fed the methyl groups, they were overweight. They were more prone to cardiovascular disease and diabetes. And, that's a lifetime of struggling with those issues that can be turned off because you optimize your methyl groups during gestation. So
that goes so far beyond don't eat sushi. I mean, that's really fascinating.
Right. Yeah. So it's an incredible gift to understand your methyl patterns and get it balanced, while you're gestating this wonderful child who, for the rest of its life, you've given it an amazing gift.
Wow. Well, I'm like chomping at the bit here now. So how if somebody wants to do this, how do they find you, and what's the protocol? How do they do this? It's not like they can't do it if they've done like Ancestry or 23andMe. They have to do your testing, correct?
Yeah, we were using their results for a while, but we found them to be very anemic for what we're looking for. They only test for about 40,000 genes, and so we have
Wow.
605,000 that we're looking at and growing. Yes, they go to myhappygenes.com, all one word. And you can kind of read more about what's going on there, look at the sample reports and see if it makes sense. We tried to make it user-friendly for kids because I'm really passionate about working with these kids and especially with, kids that are struggling with attention or, mood disorders or whatever. If you can change that trajectory for the rest of their lives, that's huge. You kind of
I do. That's amazing. I mean, I think I asked our psychiatrist once if I could get Ritalin in blow dart form because all 5 of my kids have ADHD. He didn't find it as funny as I did, but I wish I'd known all this stuff back then. But it's also, I mean, even at their ages, they're mostly out of school. This could still help them in life, right? I mean, you don't just. I mean, it would be wonderful to get these things addressed before you have the child, but if then as a child, or if not as an adult, I would imagine this would be helpful as well.
Oh man, it changed my life and it took me 50 something years to figure it out. So, but better late than never for sure.
I know. So, okay. So Happy Genes, myhappygenes.com. And I'm going to have that information in the show notes, and I will have information on Dr. Dunn, and I will have some of the things that we discussed here, some of the studies and people that you recommended, I'm going to put in our show notes. So if you're driving or going for a run, when you get home, go look at the show notes. It'll give you a whole lot of information. What have I missed? What have we not discussed? Anything?
Well, one thing I want to mention is as a special for your people, I'll give them $50 off if they use the code special50.
Oh, okay. That would be even better. So special 50.
Yeah. They use that code. They check out and that'll give them $50 off the.
Oh, that would be excellent. So I will put that in the show notes as well. You get a little discount if you use our code, and it's myhappygenes.com. And thank you so much for joining me today. It just got me thinking. I just want to get online and start reading right now, but I have work to do. And so it'll be my rabbit hole later tonight. But thank you so much. This is really, really powerful information that I think will be very relevant to any parent, if not for their children, for themselves.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it's a game changer. And once I started understanding how to work with these genetic issues, the compassion piece is huge. I have to say, I'm writing a book called Genetic Compassion, and it is
genetic
about
compassion.
Yeah, kind of understanding why we are the way they are, why we are the way we are. And I just want to plant that seed. If you're struggling and you're just beating yourself up about it, if you can just step back and go, there may be genetic variants that are causing you to be the way you are. And there's hope. There's hope of working with that and changing your brain chemistry and changing the trajectory of your life. So that's kind of cool.
That sounds like another podcast.
So
when your book comes out, I think you'll have to come back and we'll talk about having what is it? Genetic compassion or compassion for your, what did you say? Sorry.
Genetic compassion. Yeah.
Genetic compassion. We can discuss that. But that does make a lot of sense because, as I said, once you know what the issue is, you can stop feeling like it's you. I think we are programmed to think our behaviors and our thoughts and our emotions are our responsibility and our choice. And that simply isn't the case.
Right. And, it doesn't mitigate. There are traumas and there are things that happen in life that kind of aggravate these things, but your underlying biochemistry can kind of amplify the effects of those things. So, So
that would be important to know. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I greatly appreciate it. And I do look forward to your book, Genetic Compassion. And I'm definitely going to be checking out myhappygenes.com because now I'm hooked.
Fantastic. It was so great to talk to you, Dana.
Yes. Thanks for coming. Thank you so much for joining me today. Please don't forget to follow this podcast so you don't miss any new episodes, and leave a review when you have a chance. If there's anything you want to hear about or comment on, please go to my Facebook page, Special Ed on Special Ed, and find me there. I'll see you next time here on Special Ed on Special Ed. Have a fabulous day. The views expressed in this episode are those of the speakers at the time of the recording and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any other agency, organization, employer, or company, or even that individual today.